So after that opening evening of prayer and that vision of God wanting to tamper with the water systems, you can imagine that each week we came back with a new level of enthusiasm to hear what it was that God was wanting to say to us and communicate to us. And what's interesting is as we continue to pray over the next many number of weeks and months, it seemed like each time that we gathered together, there was a new theme that emerged in our prayer. We prayed the same way that we had on that first evening, taking time on our own and then coming back together and sharing. And as I say, it was like each time that we came together, something new was emerging. Common threads were being woven together. And in time, what we began to realize is each one of those common threads or those evenings, those themes, were really about values that God was speaking to us, things that were on our hearts, on His heart, which is a critical and important lesson in starting and planting a church, is that in this unique place, what you are given is an opportunity to consider thoughtfully and reflect thoughtfully on the values, the kinds of people that you want to be. But more importantly, to consider again, what are the values of God? What are the things that are on His heart? And how then should you as a community aim to reflect those values that are present with God? So what were the values? Well, as we prayed together and met together, one of the values was the theme of participation. And this was this idea of the priesthood of all believers, where God was speaking to us about how He wanted to raise up and equip the saints for the work of ministry. And I remember sometime around then, I was preaching even at our launching church, standing in front of this huge crowd of people. And sometimes when you preach, especially in multiple services, you can find that your mind can begin to wander off, even as you are communicating what it is that you feel like God has in His heart to share for you. A little insider knowledge on that one. And I remember this one time where I was preaching, and this thought was going through my mind. Am I the only one here that can do this? Or is there all sorts of people here that are equipped with gifts of teaching? And what is needed is for those gifts to be fanned into flame and for those people to be equipped. So one of the things, of course, that was on our hearts was this idea of the priesthood of all believers, what we called participation, that all of us would be participating. I've got a little cheat sheet here so I don't forget everything or anything. Another one of our values that God spoke to us was just about being an alternative society. This idea of being a group of people that lived differently within the world. That yes, we're very much embedded in the world, but that we also understood, as Scripture says, that we're called out and we're called to live according to kingdom values within all the kingdoms that are in this world. Another one of the values, as you can imagine, was mission. But in 2005, where our hearts were really being drawn to and driven toward was the mission of our neighbors and the people that were around us, directly near us, and also a mission toward the marginalized, because we saw, of course, that on the heart of God always is the care for those that are vulnerable, to the poor and the needy within our society. There was another theme, was the theme of generosity. This idea of being people, and some of our name comes from this particular value, where we would choose to live simply, monetarily and with our possessions, so that we could, as a church, have more to give away and more to support the needy in our world, that we should live even corporately on operationally less, so that there is more to care for the poor and the needy and to engage in mission around the world. Another one of our values was relationships. We sense God speaking to us about the importance of relationship and how the kingdom and the work of the Spirit is transferred person to person, and that fundamentally in the church, more than production or great religious demonstrations, what's important is people, and people living out the Christian ethic with each other, and people living out a kingdom mission and mandate with each other. And then finally, we had this idea of what we ended up calling creative flexibility. We saw that Jesus is a person, and that if we're going to be a community of people that follow a person, That means that we don't want to find ourselves entrenched into particular systems or structures or something like that, but that we want to be people that remain nimble and remain willing to change in order to best follow who Jesus is calling us to be at any given time. And so those were really the things that God was speaking to us about as we spent that year in prayer. I should tell you here that we never intended on planting a network of house churches. We didn't intend actually on planting anything when we began this whole journey. But what I'm about to tell you next is why we ended up planting a network of house churches. With all of these values that were on God's heart, one of the things that began to come clear to us, and I think that this is such a critical message, is that the structures we exist within are there in order to give life to our values. Now let me say that again. The structures that we exist within are there to give life to our values. And what is often present within the church and church structures is that they actually do the opposite of helping us to live out our values. So let's take the example of relationship, for instance. We can exist, we can say that and work time on thinking that relationships should be one of the key values that we have as a church. We want to be people that are people of love and giving our lives to one another. And yet we can end up living in these structures that spend so much energy and so much resource on activities which are fundamentally not relational. You get what I'm saying, and I don't need to say anything more about that. So the nice thing about starting a church, of course, is that you have a bit of a blank slate, and you can say to yourself, well, what kind of structure then would help us to best live out our values, which is exactly what we did at this point. As these values began to emerge, we started to say to ourselves, well, what structure? I mean, if we could live any way that we wanted to, how would we live together that would best enable us to live out these values? And so we started to think about, well, money. Well, if we want to be generous and have more to give away, that means we need to be operationally lean. So what structure would we live within so that we wouldn't have to spend so much money on ourselves? Well, maybe we should avoid having lots of staff or having buildings or those kind of things if we can at all costs. Well, then we started to think about, well, what about the priesthood of all believers? Well, we need also then to be in a structure where it's not just a pastor that we're paying to do the bulk of the work for us, but we want to see ourselves thrust into the work of ministry. Well, how do we do that? Well, we said, well, we want to be engaged in our neighborhoods. Well, we all live in homes, and you see how the dots begin to connect. And it was really like this. We live in homes, and well, if we started to meet together and worship together in homes, that would probably help us with our operational costs, and it would enable relationships, and it would force people to step into leadership and lead and teach and host and administrate and do all of these things. And so you see how this began to play out. In some ways, it was the most quote-unquote unspiritual thing that we did in the whole journey. We just looked at the kind of people that God was asking us to be and said, well, is there a structure that would best facilitate that? And that's really how we arrived at this idea of meeting together in house churches. Now, the one objection that people raised as we began to think about this was saying, well, we're going to miss seeing our friends and other people that aren't part of our network of house churches or our own house church. And so we said, well, maybe what we should do then is that once a month we should plan to all to come together for a big corporate citywide, a gathering where all the house churches would come together. So for 3 weeks we'd be in our homes, and 1 week we'd rent a facility and meet in that place. And that's how we overcame that obstacle. But that's really how we arrived at this structure of being a network of house churches.